The sun bled across the horizon, painting the scorched earth of Redemption Gulch in hues of orange and bruised purple. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated everything. The warped timber of the buildings, the exhausted faces of prospectors, and the lone figure of a woman walking down the town's only street. Her name was Alara, though no one here knew it. To the eyes that watched from behind grimy windows and shadowed porches, she was just another piece of driftwood carried in by a desperate tide. Her travel-worn duster hung loosely on her frame, failing to hide the exhaustion that pulled at her shoulders. Underneath it, a simple dress was frayed at the hem, and her boots were scuffed nearly through to the leather. The only building still humming with life was the Gilded Cage Saloon. Its batwing doors swung open and shut, spilling yellow light and raucous noise onto the street. Taking a deep breath that tasted of grit and stale beer, Alara pushed her way inside. The wall of sound and smell hit her first. A cacophony of slurred laughter, the frantic plinking of an out-of-tune piano, and the thick, cloying aroma of cheap whiskey, sweat, and unwashed bodies. Men in various states of inebriation turned to stare, their gazes lingering with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. She was an anomaly, a woman alone, and not one of the painted ladies who worked upstairs. She ignored them, her focus fixed on the hulking man behind the bar. He was wiping a glass with a rag that looked dirtier than the glass itself. His face was a fleshy roadmap of broken veins, and a greasy apron was stretched taut across his formidable belly. This was Silas, the owner, a man whose hospitality was as thin as the watered-down whiskey he served. Alara approached the bar, her steps steady despite the fatigue that threatened to buckle her knees. She waited patiently until his hostile eyes finally landed on her. "What do you want?" he grunted, not bothering to stop his work. "This ain't a charity." "I'm looking for work," Alara said, her voice low but clear, cutting through the din just enough for him to hear. "Anything, just for a meal and a safe place to sleep for the night." Silas let out a short, humorless laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. He stopped wiping the glass and leaned on the bar, his bulk looming over her. He sized her up, his gaze lingering on the hollows of her cheeks and the dust in her hair. He saw weakness, desperation, a commodity. "Work, huh?" he sneered, loud enough for the nearby Cowboys to hear. A ripple of amusement went through them. "You don't look like you can handle much." "I'm stronger than I look," she replied, her expression unreadable. His eyes narrowed. "All right, I'll give you work. The place needs a good sweeping. But you'll do it after we close, midnight, when every last drunk has been kicked out and the floors are good and filthy." He gestured to a dark, forgotten corner. "You can wait over there. Don't bother my customers." He then reached under the bar, pulled out a stale hunk of bread and a tin cup, which he filled with lukewarm water from a bucket. He slid them across the sticky bar top. "Here's your advance. Don't say I ain't generous." The men at the bar chuckled. "Look at that, Silas," one of them slurred, a lanky cowboy with a cruel smirk. "Hiring the local wildlife." Alara took the bread and water without a word. Her gaze met the Cowboys for a fleeting second, and for just a moment, the weary indifference in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of something hard and cold, like flint. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She turned and walked to the corner he'd indicated, sinking onto a small, three-legged stool. As she broke off a piece of the hard bread, she could feel their eyes on her, their judgment hanging in the thick, smoky air. They saw a beggar, a nobody. They had no idea who had just walked into their world. The hours bled into one another, each marked by the discordant slam of a whiskey glass on wood or a burst of coarse laughter that echoed off the grimy walls. From her shadowed corner, Alara became a statue carved from patience. The Gilded Cage Saloon was a living, breathing beast, and she was learning its rhythms. The air, thick with the smell of cheap liquor, unwashed bodies, and cigar smoke, felt heavy in her lungs, but her breathing remained even and slow. Her gaze, hooded and deliberate, swept the room not as a victim, but as a scout assessing enemy terrain. She noted the creaky floorboard near the bar, the way the back door swung slightly ajar, and the number of men who carried their guns with the ease of experience versus those who wore them as mere ornaments. A burly cowboy with a red-stained beard, who the others called Jed, became the nexus of the room's hostility. He slammed his fist on a card table, sending chips scattering, his voice a belligerent roar over a disputed hand. "You callin' me a cheat, bartender?" he bellowed, though his accusation was aimed at a younger, paler man opposite him. Silas, wiping a glass with a dirty rag, merely grunted. "Settle it yourselves. Just don't bleed on the floor. I've got a girl to clean it, but I'd rather she didn't have to work too hard on her first night." The remark drew a fresh wave of snickers directed at Alara's corner. She didn't flinch. Her eyes met Jed's for a fleeting second, her expression as blank and unreadable as a river stone, before he dismissed her and turned his drunken ire back to his game. Time crawled. The piano player, fingers clumsy with drink, hammered out a tune that was more noise than melody. Fights nearly broke out twice more, fizzling into resentful glares and muttered threats. Through it all, Alara sat, a silent observer to the base nature of men left to their own devices. The stale bread sat untouched beside her. Her thirst was a dull ache at the back of her throat, but she ignored it. To show any need, any weakness, would be to feed the wolves circling her. Her exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, but her spine remained ramrod straight. She was a coiled spring, the tension hidden beneath a veneer of absolute stillness. Finally, the raucous energy of the saloon began to wane. One by one, then in small, stumbling groups, the Cowboys drained their glasses and staggered out into the biting cold of the Redemption Gulch night. The boisterous cacophony dwindled to a few slurred conversations, then to the solitary clinking of Silas collecting glasses. The piano player slumped over his keys, a final, dissonant chord hanging in the air before silence took over. The last patron, Jed, shot a final, sneering look at Alara. "Don't you sweep up my luck, girl," he slurred, before pushing his way out the door, letting a blast of frigid air sweep through the room. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the noise. All that remained was the smell of spilled liquor and the sight of a floor littered with mud, discarded cards, and cigar butts. The large clock behind the bar ticked loudly, its hands creeping inexorably toward midnight. Right as the longest hand clicked into place, signaling the start of a new day, Silas turned from the bar. In his hand was a broom, its bristles worn and uneven. He walked across the now empty room, his boots echoing on the wooden planks. He stopped before her, the faint lamplight casting his shadow over her small frame. He didn't offer the broom, he threw it. It clattered on the floor at her feet. "All right, girl, you wanted work," he said, his voice laced with smug satisfaction. "The floor ain't gonna clean itself. Get to it." Alara didn't flinch as the broom clattered against the floorboards. She simply bent at the knees, her movements fluid and economical, and picked it up. The wood was rough, the bristles stiff, and caked with the grime of 100 nights just like this one. She held it not like a drifter given a demeaning chore, but like a craftsman holding a familiar tool. Her eyes, which had been cast downward in patient observation, now scanned the floor, assessing the task ahead. The gilded cage was a disaster. Puddles of spilled whiskey and beer made the floor sticky, mixing with the mud tracked in from the unpaved street. Chewed tobacco spatter stained the wood near the spittoons, and discarded playing cards lay scattered like fallen leaves. The air hung thick and stale, a cloying mix of cheap perfume, sweat, and cigar smoke. From behind the bar, Silas watched with a sneer, polishing a glass with a dirty rag. At a corner table, Jed and two of his companions lingered, having decided to stay for the show. They slouched in their chairs, nursing the dregs of their drinks, their faces lit with cruel amusement. "Look at her," Jed slurred, loud enough for Alara to hear. "Puts her back into it, might even earn that stale bread after all." His friends snickered, their laughter echoing in the now mostly empty saloon. Alara gave no sign she had heard them. She started in the far corner, her strokes with the broom long and steady. She wasn't just pushing the dirt around, she was gathering it, her method precise and organized. Sawdust, peanut shells, and other debris formed a neat, growing line before her. There was a rhythm to her work, a quiet efficiency that was strangely out of place with the chaotic mess she was cleaning. Her focus was absolute, her expression unreadable. The Cowboys' jeers slowly faded into mumbled comments as they watched her work. There was something unsettling about her composure. They had expected tears, or perhaps clumsy, resentful labor. They had not expected this quiet, detached professionalism. She moved with a purpose that defied her circumstances, her worn duster swaying with each deliberate motion. She reached the area beneath the table, where Jed and his friends sat. To get at a stubborn pile of filth wedged against a table leg, she had to bend low. She placed one hand on her knee for balance and reached forward with the broom. As she leaned over, the dark fabric of her duster pulled taut across her back and shifted to the side. For a fleeting moment, the flickering lamplight caught what was hidden beneath. Tucked securely into the small of her back was a worn leather holster, and resting in it was the unmistakable handle of a pistol. The light glinted off the polished walnut grip, and more importantly, off the metal emblem inlaid within it, the iconic rearing horse of a Colt peacemaker. One of the Cowboys, a man named Coop with sharper eyes than Jed, saw it first. The drunken grin on his face evaporated, replaced by a look of stark disbelief. He froze, his glass halfway to his lips. He nudged Jed hard, his eyes wide and fixed on Alara's back. "Jed, look," he whispered, his voice suddenly sober. Jed, annoyed at the interruption, turned to follow his friend's gaze. He saw it just as Alara began to straighten up. He saw the holster, the gun, the legendary Insignia. His jaw went slack. The third man saw it a second later. The snickering, the taunts, the entire atmosphere of mockery, it all vanished in an instant. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over their table. Silas, sensing the abrupt shift from across the room, looked up from his bar. "What's the matter with you three? Cat got your tongues," he grumbled. But then he saw their faces, pale, wide-eyed, and terrified. They weren't looking at him. They were all staring at the woman. His eyes followed theirs, landing on Alara just as she finished sweeping under the table. The duster had already fallen back into place, concealing the weapon from view, but it was too late. The secret was out. Alara, seemingly unaware of the storm she had just unleashed, continued her sweeping. The steady swish-swish of the broom the only sound in a saloon that was suddenly as quiet as a tomb. The sun was a merciless hammer in the vast, empty sky, beating down on the cracked earth of the Texas Panhandle. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything, including the lone figure walking west. Alara moved with a rhythm born of weary persistence, one worn leather boot in front of the other. Her duster, the color of the dirt itself, was a thin shield against the elements, and her face, shadowed by the brim of a stained hat, was a mask of stoic exhaustion. Yet her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. They scanned the horizon, noted the flight of a distant hawk, and tracked the shimmering heat that warped the air. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of walking, rationing sips of water from her canteen, and chewing on dry jerky that tasted of salt and regret. Nights were a brief, cold respite. She didn't dare a large fire, only a small cluster of embers to ward off the chill. Its meager light dancing on the steel of the weapon she cleaned with ritualistic care. The Colt peacemaker felt heavy in her hands, a solid, grounding weight. It wasn't just a tool, it was a legacy. She could still feel her father's calloused hand guiding hers, teaching her the balance, the draw, the patience required. "This isn't for starting trouble, Ellie," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "It's for finishing it, for protecting what's yours." Now, he was gone, and the Colt was all she had left of him, a constant reminder of a promise she had yet to fulfill. A promise that was pulling her, step by painful step, toward a town called Redemption Gulch. Her thoughts were interrupted by the crunch of gravel. Two men on horseback crested a low rise ahead. They weren't cowboys. They lacked the purpose in their posture. They were drifters, lean and hungry-looking, with eyes that roamed over her like vultures sizing up a meal. They slowed their horses to a walk, flanking her on the trail. "Well now, look what we got here," the one with the stringy beard said, his voice greasy. "A little sparrow, a long way from her nest." The other one, younger but with crueler eyes, licked his chapped lips. "Lost, ma'am? It's dangerous out here for a lady all by her lonesome." Elara stopped walking but didn't look at them directly. She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, her posture relaxed, betraying none of the tension coiling in her gut. "I'm not lost," she said, her voice low and even, carrying easily in the still air. "And I'm not a lady." The bearded man chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Feisty, I like that. Maybe you got something in that pack worth our trouble. Some water, perhaps?" He began to dismount, his intentions clear. "I have enough for me," Elara stated, her voice dropping a register, taking on an edge of cold steel. "And I suggest you keep riding." "Or what?" The younger one sneered, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his own hip. "You gonna cry?" Slowly, deliberately, Elara turned her head to face them. She didn't raise her hands or make a sudden move. She simply let her gaze fall on the younger man's hand, then raised it to meet his eyes. There was no fear in her look, only a profound and weary certainty. With a subtle shift of her shoulders, she pulled back the left side of her duster. The movement was slight, almost casual, but it revealed the worn leather holster and the dark, checkered grip of the Colt. The iconic insignia, though faded, was unmistakable in the harsh sunlight. Her hand didn't move toward it, but its presence was a shout in the sudden silence. The men froze. They saw not just the gun, but the woman wearing it. They saw the calm in her eyes, the utter lack of panic, and understood. This was not a sparrow. This was a hawk. The bearded man slowly put his foot back in the stirrup. "Just being neighborly," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Come on, Earl, let's go." They spurred their horses, kicking up dust as they galloped away without a backward glance. Elara watched them go, her expression unchanging. She pulled her duster closed, the weight of the Colt a familiar comfort against her hip. She took a small sip from her canteen, adjusted her pack, and continued her walk west. Redemption Gulch was still a few days away. The silence in the gilded cage was no longer empty. It was thick and heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of what the men had seen. It clung to the stale air like gunsmoke, suffocating the last embers of their drunken bravado. Jed, whose face had been a mask of cruel amusement moments before, was now pale, his jaw slack. His eyes were fixed on the spot where Elara's duster now safely concealed the worn leather holster. The other two cowboys were frozen, their posture stiff with a fear that was primal and immediate. They had seen more than just a gun. They had seen a symbol, a reputation forged in steel and blood. From behind the bar, Silas slammed a glass down, the sharp sound cracking the tension but failing to break it. "What in blazes is wrong with you three?" he growled, his voice a low rumble of irritation. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He hadn't seen the reveal, his view obscured by the bar and his own self-importance. He only saw three of his toughest patrons suddenly looking like spooked cattle. Jed swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp escaped. One of his companions, a lanky man named Abe, found his voice first, though it was little more than a shaky whisper. "Silas, her piece." "Her what?" "Spit it out, man," Silas snapped, wiping the bar with a rag, his frustration growing. "The gun she's wearing," Jed finally managed, pointing a trembling finger. "On the grip, the insignia. It's a Colt." Silas scoffed, a dismissive, ugly sound. "A Colt? So what? Every gunslinger and wannabe from here to the territories carries a Colt. Doesn't mean she knows which end the bullet comes out of." He sneered, looking toward Elara, expecting to see her cowering. But Elara wasn't cowering. She had straightened up slowly, the broom held loosely in one hand. Her movements were fluid and unhurried, devoid of any fear or agitation. She met Silas's gaze with an unnerving calm, her eyes holding his without a flicker of doubt. The silence from the cowboys was her validation. "It wasn't just any Colt, Silas," Abe insisted, his voice hushed and urgent. "The grip. It had the stallion, the peacemaker, the kind they give to rangers. Or marshals." The mention of rangers and marshals finally pierced Silas's thick hide of arrogance. His hand stilled on the bar. His sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of disbelief, which quickly curdled into apprehension. He looked from the genuine terror on his patrons' faces back to the woman in the center of the room. He saw her now not as a pathetic drifter, but as an unknown quantity, a potential danger standing in the heart of his saloon. The way she stood, her posture relaxed but ready, spoke of a confidence that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with capability. Elara took a deliberate step forward, the soft scuff of her boot on the dusty floorboards echoing in the tomb-like quiet. She leaned the broom against the table Jed and his friends had just vacated. She then looked directly at Sila's, her expression unreadable. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and even, yet it carried across the room with absolute clarity, cutting through the fear. "The floors are clean," she said, her tone conversational, yet it held the finality of a judge's sentence. "Is there anything else you require, or have I earned my keep for the night?" The question hung in the stale, whiskey-soaked air, sharper than a shard of broken glass. "Is the work satisfactory?" Elara's voice was low, yet it seemed to fill every corner of the gilded cage, silencing the frantic thumping of Silas's own heart. He stared at her, this slip of a woman who was now the most terrifying presence in the room. His authority, built on years of brawling and intimidation, had crumbled to dust in a matter of seconds. He tried to rally. A saloon owner in Redemption Gulch couldn't show fear. He puffed out his chest, the motion feeling hollow and performative even to himself. "Satisfactory," he blustered, his voice a rough imitation of its usual boom. "You think you can just waltz in here with a fancy iron on your hip and start mackin' demands?" He looked to Jed and the other two cowboys for support, but found none. They were frozen, their eyes wide, fixed on the Colt Insignia that seemed to burn with a cold light even in the dim lantern glow. They looked less like his cronies and more like cornered jackrabbits. He was utterly alone. Elara didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply held his gaze, her eyes a placid, unnerving gray. She took one slow step forward, the soft scuff of her worn boot on the dusty floorboards echoing like a gunshot in the silence. She leaned the broom against a nearby table with deliberate, unhurried grace. "I'm not making demands," she stated, her tone flat and final. "I'm stating the terms of my employment. The sweeping is done. Now I require a room for the night." She paused, her gaze flicking towards the rickety staircase. "The one at the end of the hall. The window faces the street. And a hot meal, steak if you have it." It wasn't a request, it was an invoice. The sheer audacity of it left Silas momentarily speechless. This woman, who hours ago had been begging for scraps, was now ordering him around in his own establishment. His pride, raw and wounded, flared. "You'll get nothin'," he snarled, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. "You'll take the stale bread I offered and be grateful for it, or you'll get out." He expected a reaction, fear, anger, anything. He got nothing. Elara's expression remained unchanged, a mask of unreadable calm. She seemed to be looking straight through him, weighing his soul and finding it wanting. "The last man who pointed a finger at me and yelled like that," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout, "lost 3 of his teeth before he could finish his sentence. He was bigger than you, Silas." His name. The way she said his name, familiar and dismissive, sent a genuine chill down his spine. It was the final blow. He was a bully who preyed on the weak, and for the first time in a long, long time, he was not the strongest person in the room. He wasn't even close. The fear he saw reflected in his men's eyes was now churning in his own gut. This wasn't some drifter with a lucky pistol. This was something else entirely. A predator. Defeated, the air rushed out of his lungs. The bluster, the anger, the pride, it all evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, trembling man. He couldn't meet her eyes any longer. He dropped his gaze to the floor she had just swept so meticulously. "The key is on the hook behind the bar," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "Kitchen's closed, but I'll see what I can find." Elara gave a single, sharp nod. Without another word, she turned and walked towards the bar, her steps measured and confident. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. She retrieved the iron key, her movements fluid and economical. Then, she ascended the stairs, disappearing into the shadows of the upper floor, leaving Silas and his terrified patrons in a silence more profound and unsettling than any brawl the Gilded Cage had ever hosted. The dawn broke over Redemption Gulch with a fragile, hopeful light, but inside the Gilded Cage, the air was thick with yesterday's fear. Ilara sat at a corner table, nursing a cup of black coffee, the picture of calm. The quiet was shattered when the saloon doors swung open, revealing Sheriff Brody, his face a mask of forced confidence. Silas trailed behind him like a vulture, his eyes burning with a hateful mix of fear and indignation. Two nervous-looking deputies flanked them, their hands hovering near their holsters. "All right, that's enough," Brody announced, his voice a little too loud. "This town has laws. We don't take kindly to drifters coming in here and making trouble." Ilara didn't rise. She simply took a slow sip of her coffee, her gaze lifting to meet the sheriff's. It was a calm, appraising look that seemed to see right through his bluster. "Trouble?" she asked, her voice low and even. "I was under the impression I was cleaning house." Silas snarled, emboldened by the presence of the law. "She threatened me. In my own establishment. I want her arrested, Sheriff, now." Brody puffed out his chest. "You heard him. You're coming with us. We'll sort this out down at the jail." He took a step forward, his hand finally gripping the butt of his pistol. The few patrons in the saloon held their breath. This was the moment the town's corrupt order would attempt to reassert itself. But Ilara didn't reach for her Colt. Instead, she slowly reached inside her duster. For a heart-stopping second, everyone expected a flash of steel. The deputies flinched, but her hand emerged not with a weapon, but with a folded piece of paper and a small tin star pinned to a leather flap. She unfolded the paper and placed it flat on the table, then set the badge beside it. The morning light caught the silver lettering, U.S. Marshal. Sheriff Brody froze, his eyes locked on the badge. The color drained from his face. "I'm not a drifter, Sheriff," Ilara said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "My name is Marshal Ilara Vance, and that," she gestured to the paper, "is a federal warrant for the arrest of Silas Blackwood for extortion and smuggling, and for Sheriff Marcus Brody for conspiracy and accepting bribes to obstruct justice." Silas stared, his mouth agape. The entire charade, the sweeping, the humiliation, had been a test. She hadn't been a victim. She had been gathering evidence, watching them expose their own rotten core. He had handed her the very broom she would use to sweep them away. This is a mistake," Brody stammered, his authority crumbling into dust. "You have no jurisdiction?" "My jurisdiction is wherever federal law is broken," Ilara interrupted coolly, her eyes finally hardening. "And in Redemption Gulch, it seems to have been broken everywhere. Now, you have two choices. You and your deputies can lay down your arms and comply, or you can resist a federal officer. I assure you, the latter option ends poorly for everyone but me." The two deputies looked from the marshal's unyielding face to their terrified sheriff, and then at each other. With a shared look of resignation, they unbuckled their gun belts and let them drop to the floor with a heavy thud. The fight was over before it began. Silas, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and rage, made a desperate, foolish lunge toward the bar, perhaps for a hidden shotgun. He never made it. Ilara moved with blinding speed, her chair scraping back as she rose, her peacemaker appearing in her hand as if by magic. The heavy click of the hammer being cocked echoed like a death knell in the silent saloon. "Don't," she commanded. It was not a plea, it was a final verdict. Silas froze, defeated. His reign, and Brody's, had ended not with a shootout, but with the quiet, undeniable weight of the law. Later that day, Ilara stood on the saloon's porch, watching as Brody and Silas were loaded onto a prison wagon, bound for a federal court. The townspeople watched from a distance, their faces a mixture of awe and relief. A new chapter had begun for Redemption Gulch. Her work was done. Without a word to anyone, she untied her horse, swung into the saddle, and rode out of town, the dust settling behind her as quietly as she had arrived.